All right, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're here at the Columbia Museum of Art. I should say I'm here at the Columbia Museum of Art. And today we're going to take a look at It's Alive. My name is Glenna Barlow. I'm the Senior Manager of Education Interpretation here, and we're excited to dig into this exhibition with all of you. So thank you for joining us. Okay, so It's Alive is it's a collection, but it's all from one person in this case. That person happens to be Kirk Hammett. I think you've probably heard of him. He's of Metallica fame, if you weren't aware. But Kirk Hammett has assembled this incredible collection, and he's graciously allowed all of us to look at it for a little while. So why horror? Which is really the subject here. Why horror? For Kirk Hammett and for a lot of people who like this sense of fear that they get from a horror film, there's this kind of scientific idea that fear and excitement are really similar sensations, right? So when we're excited or when we're afraid, your heart races and you have goosebumps and your hair stands on end, and that can be really exhilarating. Some people love that kind of sense of fear. Some people don't like it. Usually people kind of fall into one of two camps. You either love horror or it is not for you. In the case of Kirk Hammett, he was really drawn to horror because he loved this idea of kind of the other, not so much the heroes, but the villains. This person who was maybe seen as grotesque or macabre or just outside of the norm, and that's really fueled a lot of his creativity. He's drawn inspiration directly from a lot of these pieces, and so that's why he's chosen to surround himself with these works of art. And he truly believes these are works of art. So a lot of times these kinds of posters were just considered ephemera. That means they were just discarded, thrown away after the run of a film. But there's some real artistry to them. Even though they're design objects, there is a lot to see and to appreciate here. And there's a lot of work that went into them. So he was really excited to be able to showcase that with all of us. So we're gonna look at these not just as design objects, which they are, but also as art objects. And so we're gonna start here with Frankenstein. Now we're going back quite a bit. We're going back almost 100 years. So when we think about the early days of movies, remember, there's no television, right? So there's no TV advertisements, there's no trailers you can release on YouTube. How are you going to convince someone to see the movie that you're putting out? Well, posters were a really good way to do that. And so one of the early American poster designers has said that there are three things that make a really good poster. And so the first of these is that the poster has to catch your eye, right? If you're not looking at it, the poster's not doing its job. So the second thing is it has to tell you a little something about the film. It has to intrigue you enough to make you want to part with your hard-earned nickel. And then the good posters, the best posters, are the ones that have this artistic sensibility to them as well. And that's kind of seen as the third most important thing for a lot of these studios at the time, but it's still important and it's something that we'll think about today. So I want to start here with this beautiful Frankenstein poster, and let's see if this holds up as a design object. And when we say design, we really just mean that it's a visual piece or it's a tangible object, but it solves a problem or it addresses a certain challenge. In this case, the challenge is how do you get someone to want to cross the street to come see your poster and eventually see your movie, right? So it has to do that thing. So the first level, does this attract your attention? Well, right now we're kind of forcing you to look at it, right? But it's really big. So that's one way that this is definitely going to attract your eye. Even if you're just walking across the street and you happen to see something, it's really big. That's a good way to catch the eye, right? But what other ways is it kind of attracting your attention? Maybe even if you just saw it from the corner of your eye. Well, this great big word right here goes right across the middle of the page. It's in huge letters. And that bright light against that dark background is that high contrast. So you're really getting a good sense of what it says. Even from a distance, you can kind of make out maybe what some of those words say. So that's a great way to kind of play with color to attract the eye. So it's doing, I think, a pretty good job of attracting your eye. Now, what is it telling us about the film? Well, okay, we have a little bit of information, right? You know the title of the film, it's really big. So we could be forgiven for thinking this maybe is Frankenstein when we know it's Frankenstein's monster. The tagline down here tells us a little bit more. But Frankenstein's monster up here, this figure, he's cast in this really stark shadow, right? He looks really severe because of the way the lighting is hitting him. And he's got this harsh red, this bright red color to him. So this red and black, already we might start to have some associations with that, right? Red and black in a Western tradition, we tend to think of as associated with the devil or maybe evil. So we're already starting to think of that based just on the color. So let's think now about some contrast between this harsh red, this really high saturated color, and then what's happening down here, right? We've got these same warm kinds of tones, these orangey pinks and reds, but they're much more subdued, right? So they're a lot more low saturated color. So not only is the space divided by this text right here, but we're also setting up a contrast between these two figures by the colors that we're using. So think too about these figures now for a moment. What can you guess about, let's say this figure up here, the monster figure? How do we know he's a monster even? What can you guess about his character or what he might be like? So drop us a comment, let us know what you think. Think about his expression. Think about the ways that the artist is depicting him. Without giving us any kind of verbal information, what is he cluing us in on? So this is already setting up this kind of contrast, right, between these two figures. Already we have this sense of villain and victim. Our victim in this case, as we'll see again and again, is this female figure. She's lying very passively, perhaps unconscious. So that's a trope that we're going to see again and again in these kinds of horror films. We will talk more about that, but for now we're just going to think about kind of the contrast that's set up between these two and how all of that visually combines to give us some idea of what's happening in the story and what this kind of antagonism might look like. So as you're thinking about all of that visual information, I want to just give us a little bit of backstory about Frankenstein himself and the story. So this, of course, goes back to the story from Mary Shelley. She wrote it in 1818 when she was just 18 years old. And the story is really about the creation of this monster. So Dr. Frankenstein creates life, basically, from dead matter. So he is basically playing God, right? He's this sort of mad scientist type figure. He's creating life, but it goes awry. It's a little bit different in the book than it is in the film. In the book version, the original, the monster is, grotesque, and the doctor is repulsed and runs, he flees. And so the monster's reaction then in the story is one of being rejected, really, by his proto-parent type figure. Whereas in the movie version, they chose to have the monster be implanted with the brain of a homicidal maniac. Oops. So it's a biological reaction, right? So getting this notion that science is kind of something to be feared, or at least it's something there's an anxiety about. And this makes sense when we think about the roots of the romantic work of art that this came from, right? The romanticism of someone like Mary Shelley, they were reacting against these 19th century ideas around the Enlightenment and that everything could be understood through reason and logic and science. And they were kind of, bucking against that. So this sense of romanticism has its roots in the original story, but we see how it filters down into the 20th century. And a great illustration of that and this sort of sense of science and the mad scientist as a figure is our Zabatron. So we're gonna shift around just a little bit so that you can see it. But basically, this is an ode to the machine age, and it would have been part of this huge set that would have had gleaming lights and lots of machinery, and this is a great illustration of that. So we'll check that out in just a second. All right, so here we've got our Zabatron. It even has a crazy kind of name that sounds far off and sort of science fiction-y. But you can see it's just a crazy contraption, that was totally fabricated for this film. It's just a prop, but it really gives you a sense of how they had set up this sort of gleaming, cathedral to the machine age, this kind of glorification of science. But of course, in this case, science is set up as the antagonist or something that causes this downfall. So we're going to see that again and again, where this pursuit of knowledge or the idea of science is sometimes pitted as the source of evil or something to be feared or distrusted. So we're going to see how that plays out in other films. But now I want to take us back and we're going to look at another film from the 1930s. Okay, great. So now we have The Mummy. So as you may note, this is, well, let's start with this. Why don't you tell me how this poster compares to the last one that we saw? So think about the Frankenstein poster, the way the text was used, the use of color, the size, all of that. How does this differ from that a little bit? And how is it a little similar? Because certainly there's this kind of vocabulary of movie poster imagery and these kind of trends that are going to start to be used. So the film producers and the movie studios are starting to build up this vocabulary. So they're drawing on these different kinds of trends. So while you're thinking about that and you're giving us some comments, we'll start to look at this image itself. As you may know, it stars Boris Karloff again, but he gets top billing this time, right? His name was teeny tiny before, but the Frankenstein film really made him a star. So he's definitely getting top billing in this one. So again, we have a similar kind of setup. We've got this high contrast, and we've got this demarcation of space, not with text this time, but just by using different zones of the picture plane, right? So already, again, we're setting up this sense of contrast. So what do you notice about these two figures? How do they contrast? So think about things like color. I want you to think about things like pose and expression. How are they set up to look different visually? And how is that giving us a clue about their relationship in the film? So let's think about color first. So we've got these kind of yellowy greens of the mummy figure, and that's, we sort of associate that with this sickly quality. It has this kind of feeling of disease to it. So we've got those sort of cool kind of grotesque sorts of colors. But then if we look down here at the female figure, warmer, brighter colors. We've got these peaches and pinks. She's got this sort of rosy glow, right? But if we think about the color overall, we see a lot, again, high contrast again. But we see a lot of blues, these rich kind of lapis sorts of blues, and these bright orangey golds. So there's a couple of reasons that the designer probably did that. Well, again, it's high contrast. These colors are basically opposites, just like we see white on a black field, and it shows up really well. Blue and orange are complementary colors. So they're basically, if you think back to your color wheel, they're on opposite sides. They're basically opposites. So that means the orange is really going to pop against that blue background. But why else might you use blue and orange for this subject? Well, if you think about the subject matter, it's the mummy. So we're thinking about ancient Egypt. And if you think about images you've seen of ancient Egypt, you might think of the gold on the side of a tomb, or this beautiful lapis lazuli, those blue stones. Blue and oranges, and especially gold, those are colors you see again and again in Egyptian art. And why would this have been in the public consciousness in the 1930s? Well, in 1922, we have the discovery of King Tut's tomb, and then the subsequent excavation. So that just launches this worldwide interest in everything Egyptian. So we see a resurgence in things like movies, in music, and even in advertising. Ancient Egypt was evoked to sell palm olive and things like that. So they're using this kind of Egyptian imagery because it was in the public consciousness. And blue and orange are a signal to that kind of culture. So again, thinking about our two figures, we've got color that kind of sets them apart. They're in different zones of the picture plane. We've also got the pose though. Our mummy in this case is actually the one who's a little bit more passive. He's lying recumbent. He has this closed kind of posture, right? As you would expect a mummy to be if they're, in ancient Egypt. He's got his arms against his chest, laying flat. This figure, however, she is almost doing the opposite. Her arms are outstretched. She looks somewhat defensive, perhaps, although she's, maybe bolstering herself up on that stela behind her. But she looks a little bit more active, actually. This is something we don't often see in posters from this era, but we get an interesting contrast between the two. Again, they're set up as antagonists, but we have this different kind of sense of a female figure here. But look at her styling. She is 100% from the 1930s, right? She's got her slinky dress, she's got her short hair that's coiffed, her makeup. Even though we're presuming the setting is Egypt or ancient Egypt, she is very much of the era when this movie came out. And we see that a lot in films from this and other decades. So we get a really good sense here of this vocabulary that the designers are starting to build around movie posters. So we're going to start to see how they play with some of those ideas. And before we go to see another poster, I wanted to give you another glimpse of this film, of The Mummy, in the form of some of our lobby cards. So we're going to head right over there. All right, so I hope you can see these. I don't know if you can hear me, but these are lobby cards. And I love that, maybe you can hear me better here. Great. Okay, so these are lobby cards. And I just want to pause here for a moment because these are such a cool thing and we don't really have them anymore. They're kind of a lost art. But lobby cards were actually a uniquely American innovation. These theaters were starting to pop up around the US in the 1930s, the Nickelodeon theaters, because they cost a nickel to see a movie. And so they had to fill them with something. And so that's where lobby cards came in. You could have these little vignettes that showed you a little bit more about the movie. Now again, these are still design objects. They're still trying to coax you to see the movie, but they don't have to do the heavy lifting of a poster, or they have to bring you in off the street. You're already in the lobby. So this can give you a little bit more information. It can be a little more detailed because you're not looking at it from so far away. And there's multiples, right? There are different ones. So you can get, by looking at all of them, you get a bigger sense or maybe a better sense of what might happen in the film. So they're giving you scenes that would intrigue you. They are in color, even though these films would not have been. So these were hand colored, just to give you a little pop of something in the lobby. So a lot of you probably remember lobby cards. They were around for several decades. I know that they used to be outside of theaters sometimes. So if you have a memory of lobby cards or seeing these when you went to the theater, let us know. We'd love to hear that. Any of your kind of nostalgic ideas about the movies. It's great. I mean, that's a lot about why Kirk collected these pieces in the first place. So movies are wrapped up in nostalgia. So if you have a memory of the first time you went to see a movie at the theater or your first scary movie you saw, let us know. We want to hear about that. So I'll let you take a look at these, and then we're going to make our way to the next gallery. All right, so here we are at Nosferatu. Now here, we have a totally different kind of movie poster, right? We've talked about some of the techniques that movie studios are starting to use to give you a sense of what's happening in these movies. And now we're trying a different approach altogether. Some of that has to do with the time and place this poster dates to. So this is a little bit earlier. This film was from 1922. And this is actually a Spanish version of the poster. So if you're seeing Spanish down here, it's not because the film was Spanish, it was a Spanish release of this German film. But let's look at the design of this poster. So we're not getting this setup of one victim, one villain, the kind of relationship in between those two people. So what clues then are we given about this figure? What are we meant to guess about him? How do we know that he's something we should fear? So let us know, drop in a comment and give us your take on this poster before we dive into it together. So again, I want you to think about things like color, composition, how everything is arranged, the text, the expression, all of those details combined. Those are all thoughtfully put together to give you an idea about this film and to make you intrigued or want to see it. All right, so as you're commenting, we're going to take a look at this image here. So we're thinking about this figure. Obviously, this figure is central. They're framed by the bars here. And so we're meant to notice him. He's the only figure there. But why do we know to fear him just sort of intrinsically? What are those clues that the designer gives us that tells us, this is someone you should look out for? Well, we've got some visual shorthand in the form of the bars on this window, right? Because either he's been imprisoned, perhaps for some kind of wrongdoing, or maybe we're on the inside and the bars are meant to keep him out. But either way, he's being separated from us by this brick and this grill, the metal on the window. I guess it's a window. But what else? Look at the figure itself, or himself. We've got these pointed ears. We've got sharp teeth, this really severe angular face. The coloring, he's got this sort of greenish tinge to him. And if you look closely, you might be able to see that his fingers kind of come to a point, almost like a claw. So all of that combines to give this sense of an animalistic kind of figure. He doesn't seem altogether human. He definitely has these beastly kind of qualities. And often in film and in culture, and even if we think back to things like the ancient Greeks, we see examples of kind of hybrids or animals that are monstrous. And so there's a real sense that that's something that we're tapping into kind of culturally. So we have these clues that we're meant to fear this figure. The word Nosferatu might not have meant anything to the viewer then, because this was, as we'll discuss, this is an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's original Dracula from the 1890s. So this is, Nosferatu is sort of a made-up word. They used it so they didn't have to use Dracula and pay Bram Stoker's widow for the rights to it, which was a whole other story. She was not happy about that. But Nosferatu doesn't intrinsically mean anything to our viewer, so you had to use all these little clues to tell the viewer what to expect. And look at the text itself. Now, the lettering in particular, the actual typeface that we're using here, this looks very much like other advertisements you would see in the 1930s, especially in Europe and even in Spain. It's bright yellow, which was intentional. Yellow and black was thought to be one of those classic combinations. It's really high contrast. It's why we have caution tape that's yellow, right, with black letters. You see it from afar. So yellow and black is something that we see a lot in these posters, and there's no surprise there. The lettering, the kind of blocky style of it is also very typical of 1930s kind of Art Deco aesthetic. But look at the way the letters are grouped together, right? They're not just put together, spaced out equally, really clear. They're almost encroaching on one another. It looks like someone said, I think they're devouring each other. So, and there's these shadows that are caused by this overlap. So there's this sense that they're hemming in this figure, they're closing in on them. So there's kind of, even though the text seems maybe at first glance straightforward, there's also some subtle implications that are happening because of the way the letters are placed. So again, that's really all the visual information we have here. It's meant to kind of intrigue us, but it's not giving us a lot of information. What we know about the Dracula story, and about this film in particular, because of course now we've seen it, is that this is really about a plague. And this figure was thought to be the cause of that plague. So if we think about his rat-like sort of features, that kind of makes sense. We often associate rats, maybe unfairly, with plagues. And so this idea of pestilence and grime, dirt, and all of those things that come, about because of this sense of a plague. But, why would that have made sense in the 1920s and into the 1930s? Well, in the 1920s, the world is still reeling from World War I, right? The population has been decimated. And then in 1918, what happens? The Spanish influenza. So again, the population takes a real hit. Some towns are really destroyed for both of those reasons. And so while it seems maybe strange that you would have a film that's talking about the plague so soon after these things had happened, it's also sort of cathartic, right? It's kind of comforting to watch a film where there's a resolution and there's one central cause that you can pinpoint for something that seems so hard to control. I think it's the same reason that people are watching Contagion right now, because there's this sense that you can have some kind of comfort in knowing that something will be resolved and there are answers out there. So Nosferatu kind of did the same thing. There's even this suspicion that Nosophoros was the derivation for Nosferatu, and that means plague carrier. So thinking about how this fits in the context of the time and how it feeds into or builds on some of those anxieties that were there. All right, we're gonna make our way to another similar film. Okay, I say similar because of course they have the same source material. Here we can tell this is Dracula. But again, I just want to start by asking, what is the first thing that you notice when you see this poster? What jumps out at you right away? So drop in a comment, what was the first thing you saw when you focused on this image? So probably one of those big things that's going to jump out at you is the text, right? It's really big. It's, again, yellow and black. That high contrast really catches your eye. But what about these eyes? Did you notice those floating eyes in the darkness? So here, in this instance, and I should say there were lots of different versions of Dracula posters. This is just one. But in this version, the artist has chosen not to give us the whole figure of Dracula. And why? Why do you think an artist would make that choice? Why would just showing you a pair of floating eyes be something that the artist would want to do? So drop in a comment, let us know what your take is. But for one thing, we know that in the actual film, in Dracula, Bela Lugosi, who plays Dracula, there's this sense of his eyes having power. So there's a lot of close-ups on his eyes and the sense that he can use them to manipulate people. So no surprise, we're seeing the eyes here, but instead of seeing his whole face, we're just getting the eyes looking out from this sort of inky blackness. And that gives you maybe the sense that it's this fear of the unknown sometimes that's just as great as the fear of something we can see. And so that might have played on some viewers' sensibilities. Also, we know people have done studies of horror movie posters, and time and again, the imagery that tops the list is eyes and facial features. So why is that? We're just genetically predisposed to be attracted to eyes. We tend to notice them. And eyes have a particular implication when we think about horror because they can have this kind of sinister quality to them. All right, so what else is going on in the poster? We get, again, this bright, bold text, inky blackness, but how is this film being portrayed? Maybe it's not so much as a typical horror film or what we might think today of as a typical horror film. I mean, take a look at this tagline. The story of the strangest passion the world has ever known. And then one of the, in the press books, one of the taglines was, "The crimson kiss of Dracula will thrill them to the core." So this is not being billed as your traditional horror film. This was actually really being played up as a gothic romance. And there's a reason that the filmmakers decided to make that choice stylistically with the advertising. Because this actually predated Frankenstein, just barely. This was also 1931. So this was really the first American full-length horror film. And the studios weren't really sure how the public was going to react to that. So they didn't really go all in on the horror aspect. They wanted to play up something that people already understood. And they knew that gothic sense of horror from the Dracula story they might have known. And they understand romance. So they really played up that aspect of it. And so that's where we get to our female figure. Again, we have a recumbent female. She looks very vulnerable. And so this plays into another aspect of the film, and that's this notion of sexuality. So she's very much in the style of the time, right? She's got her short coiffed hair, heavy makeup, you know, she's got her revealing negligee. So she is not in the Victorian attire that would be the setting for this film, right? She has no high frilly necklines, nothing like that. She's very much looking like a 1930s star. So there's this notion that Dracula, because it was played up as this romantic kind of role, there's this notion of the dangers of sexuality that are sort of underlying a lot of interpretations of Dracula. And that has a lot to do with how the character himself was played. So Bela Lugosi, I know you can't really see him on this poster, but when you think of Dracula, you're probably picturing Bela's take on Dracula. You're thinking of someone probably in formal attire, something like a tuxedo, maybe an opera cape, and that's very much the way that Bela played this character. He played it as sort of debonair and charming, and that kind of made it all the more sinister, right? Because if this threat, if this evil can be sitting next to you at the opera or at the table across from you at a restaurant, that's kind of terrifying, right? So there was this sense of kind of romance to it, and it also maybe had this undertones of warnings against wanton sexuality. But there's another important implication to the depiction of Dracula I want to touch on briefly, so we're going to move over here for just a second. All right. So now we can see Bela in his, with the full effect. He's got his cape, he's in his formal tuxedo. But what's important here, I think, is that he's stepping, if you look carefully, you can see he's stepping off a boat. So Dracula does not lose his Eastern European roots. Even Bela Lugosi himself was Hungarian, and he had a strong accent. He didn't downplay that. So there's a very real political undertone to this. We're thinking, remember, this is the 1930s. So we had just seen legislation in the United States that limited immigration from Eastern Europe. And now we have an image of this Eastern European figure descending into England, stepping off of a boat. And so it probably played into some of these very real fears or anxieties that, that were being made a lot of in those days. So there's a political kind of aspect to this film, as well as kind of a cultural or moralizing one. And so that kind of takes us through the 1930s. These films were a huge success. These were a game changer for the studios. Frankenstein and Dracula and all of the Wolfman and movies that came after, they had a huge impact on the film industry. But then what happened in the 1940s? Well, World War II, right? Of course. So, you know, during the World War, there was upheaval of just about everything. It touched every part of life. And of course, movies were still being made, but by and large, people were not really interested in seeing horror movies when they could see real life horrors all around them. So really, if we think about the horror movie as a genre, it kind of grinds to a halt in the 1940s. So what we're gonna do is move along physically and temporally into the 1950s. So we're gonna head this way. Okay, so if you're just joining us, welcome. We're here at the It's Alive exhibition at the Columbia Museum of Art. We're talking about all these great horror movie posters throughout the decades of the 20th century, and now we're into the 1950s. So if we think about the 50s, remember, horror films are almost always a mirror of society. So in some way, they're reflecting certain anxieties or latent fears that kind of pervaded everyday life. So if we think about the 1950s, think about what's going on in that era, especially in the US, especially in the United States. So think about that as we look at some of these images. So here, we have a totally different take on the horror movie poster, right? There's no longer any kind of obvious villain or even one clear victim. We don't have that kind of dichotomy anymore. So based on just this poster, what would you say? What would you guess about maybe the setting of this film? What could you guess about the plot? I mean, what do you think is happening here based on the clues that we're given? It's very different, right? So drop us a comment, let us know what you think. But let's look at some of the visual imagery that would give us a clue. So first off, we have, I don't know if you can see it down here, but we've got this image of this just chaotic scene. The buildings are askew, there are massive tidal waves, people are running and fleeing and screaming, and we've got this text that's so bold and dynamic. It is literally, it's jumping out at you. They're using shadows and this kind of sense of depth and that illusion of three-dimensionality to make you think they're kind of shouting at you. It's like every word should have an exclamation point after it. Again, it's bright yellow, so it really catches the eye. But we're starting to see these other elements that might give us clues about the setting, and that this is no longer the gothic horror or the crumbling castles and that kind of imagery. We are in the present day, or perhaps even the future. And we know because we see some little hints to current technology. So again, think about what was going on in the 50s. Everyone is still reeling from the aftermath of a world war, and that includes things like the realities of nuclear weapons. Technology changing rapidly. So all of a sudden technology is all around you and everything from plastics to rocket ships. And so that must have been a lot to process. And so there's no surprise that this gets synthesized down into the pop culture that people consume, right? So what are people fearing in the 1950s? Well, destruction by nuclear war, right? So we're starting to see these rocket ships, these airplanes, all of these things that hint at destruction. And indeed it says right there in black and white, planets destroy Earth. I mean, destroying Earth is a pretty cataclysmic problem to have in your film, right? So there is no shortage of high drama going on in these films. Look at the colors that the artist is using now too. We don't have this kind of somber, sort of toned down color. We get really bright, bold colors. Again, this is in Technicolor now, so they really want to play that up. That's a big deal. So we're starting to use really high saturated reds and yellows, really want to play that up. So thinking about that, the use of all of these colors and the different posters, again, I don't think I mentioned it, these are all lithographs. So these were all printed. Their designs were originally painted or drawn, but then they were printed. And this is all done by lithography. We have a great video that explains all about lithography. If you're curious, it does a great job of telling you and showing you exactly that process. You can drop on our Museums from homepage if you're curious, but basically every color would have meant a new layer. So think about that when you're thinking about all the colors that you're seeing in these images. All right, so we're seeing these latent fears about nuclear technology and nuclear warfare. So that's definitely combining to form this new kind of horror film. It's not just horror anymore, it's kind of science fiction wrapped up into the idea of what scares us. So along those lines, we're gonna shift over here just a touch. All right, now we're gonna look at, there we go. All right. So we've got another example here. Again, we're thinking about that kind of science fiction meets horror trope. So right off the bat, how would you compare this poster to the last one that we saw? Really similar in terms of the subject matter, right? But how would you compare it in terms of, think about things like the color, the text, the composition. How does it seem similar, or how is it a departure? So while you're taking all that in, let's, well, first of all, H.G. Wells. So the viewers probably would have been somewhat familiar with H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. If they hadn't read the original story, they may have been familiar with the 1930s radio play by that other Wells, Orson. So they may have known the story a little bit, but what are we getting from this poster? Well, look at the text. It's not this kind of standardized typeface anymore, right? We're getting this kind of handwritten scrawl. It's kind of off kilter. And it has this effect of being like it was scrawled hastily, like there's something going on right now that you need to know about. So there's this kind of immediacy to the typeface here. Again, we get this sort of yellowish white on a darker background, so that pop of color and that high contrast. And what about the other colors? Well, we've got red and green. Complementary colors again. So those kind of opposite colors that will give you this really high sense of contrast and really jump out at you. And if we think again about what is going on in the minds of the typical American viewer at this point in time, well, other latent fears in addition to the threat of nuclear annihilation was communism, right? So it's not hard to imagine these as green tanks rolling across a field instead of little green saucers in the sky. It's no surprise that these are aliens, right? This is a threat coming from another world or an outside source. And then the red of the sky kind of harkens back to that Red Scare and this very visceral notion that communism was a clear and present danger to Americans. And so they're really playing on those fears. They're heightening that sense of anxiety. And this poster does a beautiful job of illustrating those kinds of fears that were, again, pervasive in American society and just sort of crystallized in these images. All right, now we're going to shift ever so slightly. Okay, so now we have what seems like kind of a departure, but there's a connection. So this is one of the examples of what we lovingly call creature features, right? So this seems like it's going back to the days of old, right? These kind of monster movies, but they're still rooted in the 1950s. And that's because we have the sense that these creatures are the outcome of nuclear war. So they're kind of a result of the fallout from nuclear threats or nuclear testing or whatever it may be. So in this case, the creature from the Black Lagoon is born up from this body of water because there's been nuclear testing done there. So this is a direct result of man's need to again, we're seeing that idea of science and that fear of new technology and the pursuit of information. But this creature is being seen as a direct result of that kind of impetus to develop more technology and to look into scientific pursuits. But this poster is really great because this, even though it seems like, well, it's just a B movie, it's not as, maybe it wasn't as important to a movie studio as something that starred, big names at the time, but that actually kind of paradoxically allowed the artist to have a little more freedom. So if you think about something like a poster for a movie with Fred Astaire, well, Fred Astaire, by contract, his name had to be in letters that were a certain size at the very top of the page, and there maybe wasn't much room for anything else. Maybe you'd see his face, maybe you'd see him dancing, but you don't get a whole lot of information. And maybe if you want to see a Fred Astaire movie, that's all the information you need. But with this, you need a little context, right? You need to know something about this creature from the Black Lagoon. We do have the names of the stars here, but that's not really what's front and center. We're getting this huge monster who seems to be towering over us because of the size. Again, those bright red glistening lips on that algae green of the skin really jump out at us. We get a lot more visual information, right? We get little vignettes about what might happen. So we're getting all of these little clues that will hopefully entice us to see a film. Remember, this is during the rise of the drive-in movie. So you've got this whole teenage audience that's interested in seeing these kind of movies at the drive-in. So all of those things combine to tell us a little something about what's going on culturally in the 1950s and how that's reflected in our popular culture, even if just through the lens of horror films. All right, we're gonna head into the next room. So we're gonna take a pan around so you can get a good look before we jump in. Okay, great. All right, so hopefully you got a little bit of a view of some of the images in this room. Here, I really wanted us to dive into the way females are depicted in a lot of these films. So again, if you're just jumping in, welcome. Thank you for being here with us. This is our tour of It's Alive. We're at the Columbia Museum of Art, and we talked about this a little bit at the beginning if you were with us. But there's some interesting ways that women have been depicted in these films, right? This is no surprise. Movies are, again, just kind of a mirror of our society. They're a product of everything else that's going on in a certain culture. So it's not surprising that women are shown in different ways over the eras, right? Over these different decades. So for decades, for the first, I would say, 4 or 5 at least decades of film, women are typically shown in one of two ways. The woman is either the helpless victim, she's totally passive, she might be virginal, or she might be, wrapped up with this idea of innocence, and she might be, helpless. But a hero comes along and, hopefully saves her from this horrible fate, be that at the hands of a monster or some other sinister threat. But she's painted as very passive, and she's basically an allegory. She's just an idea of innocence or of virtue or whatever it might be. She doesn't have a whole lot of agency. She doesn't really drive her own destiny. Then there's the other woman. This I'll call the siren, or sometimes the vamp is kind of used in this way too. But the siren, this is a woman who is luring men in, usually with her charms, which are on full display. So she's using her sexuality, she's using her physical appearance to lure men in, and she's kind of an agent of evil. It's important to note, though, that she's usually not the one who's, even though she seems to have more power, she's usually not the one who's ultimately in control. Often she's hypnotized or she's under the power of someone else. So even though she maybe has this semblance of power, she's ultimately usually doing that in the service of another man. So this is a great example of that kind of siren woman. But again, this did not come about all of a sudden in films. This is something that we've seen for years and years. There's no shortage of paintings of nude women that were painted, primarily for men to enjoy looking at, right? And then in terms of our own collection, if we think back to, again, that Romantic era, the pre-Raphaelites are a great example of, wanting to hark back to an earlier, maybe simpler time, but they were also ones who kind of played up this idea of the woman as a decoy, or someone who's trying to lure men in, this kind of with her siren song. We have a great painting in our collection called The Decoy. This pre-Raphaelite woman is doing exactly that. She is luring a man in. So there are many examples of precedent for this kind of trope. It's not that we only see it in film, but we do see it on full display in a lot of these posters. So we wanted to address that because, of course, if we're looking at this from the lens of, 2020, it's kind of problematic. But we have to remember that these are, cultural icons. These are artifacts that tell us about what life was like in a certain time. They're, yes, produced by certain people who had certain viewpoints that, of course, play a role in how people are depicted. But, we want to make sure that we're thinking about these in terms of their context so we can better understand them. And then we'll start to see a little bit of a departure. And so that's where we're headed next. Okay, so in the 1960s, we're starting to see a little bit of, again, some shifts happening in the landscape of horror film. We still do see some examples of kind of classic horror, but we're starting to see more psychological kinds of thrillers. And if we think about it, this is not relegated just to film. If we think about literature, there's things like A Clockwork Orange and Lord of the Flies. And, we're starting to think more about these cerebral, psychological works of art, works of literature, and of course that extends to film as well. So as we do get into these more, psychological, cerebral kinds of themes, we get more interesting characters, and sometimes those are women. Sometimes we have female protagonists. So here we've got this great poster. I just want to give you a moment to really take it in. There is a lot going on here, but it's very different from everything we've seen before. So I want to give you a moment to just take this image in and tell us, what do you think of this image? And what does it say to you about the film? Especially if you haven't seen this movie, I would love to hear your take. What do you think this film is about based on all the visual imagery you're taking in? So thinking about the text, the color, the use of space, just thinking about how the artist is trying to convey something that's maybe hard to convey in a tangible way, something that's maybe more psychological. How is the artist doing that? So let us know, drop in a comment, what do you think is happening in this film based on what you see? I'd love to know, because there's a lot going on, but it's not giving us all the answers either. So, okay, so first off, we have the same image that's we've repeated 4 times, but it's overlaid with a different color. So what effect does that have? We've got this sort of ominous text. Again, that white on black is really high contrast, but look at all the negative space. So that's just sort of that space where there's nothingness around these 2 figures. It's sort of shifted in terms of the placement of the central image, but there's still all this darkness around them. So what impact does that have? Well, these 2 figures are so close together, they're like conjoined actually, right? They're on top of each other. And yet there's all this inky kind of black emptiness outside them. So what does that say? Maybe that they're isolated, maybe the way that their mental state is, maybe how they're feeling, maybe it's a reflection of that. And so we're already starting to think that something is going on. There's some kind of relationship between these 2, and it seems like they're at odds based on, their expressions and those kind of visual clues. But then if we look down here as well, look at the typeface here. So again, we don't get that kind of really regular, polished kind of text. It's not handwritten necessarily, but it's irregular. right? It's kind of a little bit off kilter. It's just a little askew. And then we get this really hauntingly eerie image of the baby doll. She's completely upended. She's, she's been decapitated. And then there's this gashing, this gash of a hole in the front of her head. So obviously that's what Freud might call the uncanny, right? This idea that there's something here that's out of place. It doesn't fit with what we would normally think of as the setting or the context for a baby doll, which would, normally be pleasant. So there's this really kind of eerie quality that all of that combines to give us. So we're starting to see how films are getting a little bit more psychological, and they're giving women, if not more agency, at least more developed characters, right? This makes sense when we think about everything else that's going on in the 60s, right? We're thinking about women's liberation, but also some pushback against that. And a lot of these films really have to do with the idea that people are not always comfortable with all of these changes that are happening. It happened in Romanticism. It happens again when we think about things like immigration maybe, or the threat of communism or nuclear war. All of these changes is a lot to process. And so film gives us a way to kind of try to make sense of that, whether we're pushing against it or figuring it out. All right, we're gonna make our way this way, and we're gonna have a quick stop before we hit our next gallery. All right, I wanted to stop briefly at Psycho. Of course, it's an iconic film, but I love the visual aspect of this poster. As you might have noticed, it's organized in this little group of three that were this mini kind of comedy section. You may be surprised to learn, as I was, that Psycho was originally billed as a comedy, which, I've seen Psycho and I didn't laugh that much. But anyway, we've got this great visual component to it. It's really bold and graphic, but I wanted to think about how this plays into not just kind of cultural norms, but the art that's happening at this time. I mean, if you look at this and the way that these prints are done, first we're using photography, so that was fairly new for some of these posters, but the overlay of different colors and the style of printing, it's very much reminiscent of pop artists like Roy Lichtenstein and Andy Warhol. We can almost imagine this is one of his signature Marilyns overlaid with different colors, right? So, all of these different arts are talking to each other. Artists are aware of what filmmakers are doing and vice versa. So we're thinking about all those components when we think about something like design. It's not all separate. It's all, part of this artistic milieu. All right, we're gonna head this way. Great. All right, so now, again, welcome. If you're just joining us, thank you for being here. We are at the It's Alive exhibition at the Columbia Museum of Art, and you picked a great time to join in if you're just joining us, because we're going back a little bit in time. And we have to stop and talk about this film because it's just so important. We're going all the way back to the 1920s. This is 1921, which makes it just about the first full-length horror film, period. This is a silent film. It's from Germany. But before I give too much more away, I want to get a sense of what you can glean from this poster. Again, we've been talking a lot about different kind of tropes and techniques that artists are using to create these works of design. What kinds of things are you noticing in terms of color, line, composition, what's included in the image, what's left out? So as you're noting that and giving us some comments there, focus in on the face here, if you can. So take a look at this image and really examine it in terms of those basic elements of art. So let's think about something like line. look how angular the lines are in this figure's face, right? Even his eyes and his mouth are all made up of these kind of jagged lines. We're not seeing any kinds of curves or softness. It's all angular. And then the color is really kind of bright, almost garish. His face is really bright. And then there's these harsh shadows that are being created by, again, that angular quality of his face. So you're getting this sense of contrast. It's giving you a sense of, I think, intensity. You get a real sense that you don't know exactly what this figure is all about, but he looks like someone who's maybe aggressive and someone who would be intense about whatever it is he's doing. We can probably assume that this is Dr. Caligari, right? Since he's the only figure we see, and we know that's the title of the film. So again, we're getting a sense there's probably this mad scientist kind of trope. This is something that goes way back. Again, it's thinking about ideas of manipulating, playing God, this thought of the pursuit of knowledge or science as being something to be a little bit wary of, perhaps. But I love this image because not just does it have that great quality to the face, but if we look at the outside, what do you notice? I mean, we're not getting a lot of clues about the setting or other characters or, the time period, any of that. We're just getting this sort of abstracted line and color and shape. And if we think back, I mean, again, this is 1921, it's pretty early. Abstraction in art even is fairly new at this time. So that's kind of radical. But the shapes and the colors, the movement of the shapes themselves indicates something about, or maybe hint at something that's going to happen in this film, because the movie is all about insanity and hypnosis. So if we think about that and looking at this sort of visual shorthand, it's hard to depict something like hypnosis. It's really abstract, just as a concept. So it makes sense that they would employ this kind of abstracted form to sort of hint at those ideas. Now, if you've seen this movie, you'll know that the set, the art direction of this film is really one of a kind. Even 100 years later, there's never been anything like it. And a lot of people think it looks sort of cubist because it has that kind of angular quality, kind of like the face here. But that's not really the source. There's some similarities, but it's not really the source that the filmmakers were looking at. They were actually looking at German expressionist art. So expressionist art basically just comes out of the aftermath of World War I. Again, World War I was decimated. People had never seen these kinds of horrors, and suddenly they were confronted with them firsthand. So artists, trying to make sense of that, they didn't want to go back to making beautiful pictures anymore. They wanted to try to deal with that reality. So they started making things that were ugly, or that kind of explained or helped them to process those internal emotions that they were feeling. Not what things looked like in the actual world around them, but how they felt to them. So as a result, you get things that are kind of manipulated. They're sometimes grotesque, sometimes elongated or jagged, abstract. So you're starting to see that sensibility of emotion, and that plays into the art that's being made. The filmmakers were absolutely inspired by that, and you see it if you've ever seen the film or if you've seen stills from it. You can see that absolutely when you take a look at those images. I love that it's called a photo play. This is so early on, we didn't even have a word for what this was yet, so we just kind of stuck two words together that people understood, photo and play, like, email, electronic mail. We kind of know what that is, at first glance. So this is a photo play. And again, even though this was 100 years ago, this is an incredible film. So some of you may have been lucky enough to join us when we showed this movie at the Nick a little while ago. No one moved the whole run of that show. Everyone was rapt. So it is truly an incredible film. So if you haven't seen it, do take a look. This is just a great representation of kind of abstract ideas, but in a more tactile, kind of artistic way. All right, and I have to look over here because there's no getting out of here without taking a moment to appreciate the awesome stature of this King Kong standee. So this is just, again, we're going back to the 30s, but this is another great way that advertisers and movie studios were really being innovative. So this is actually just a poster. This was a poster that was sent to the movie theater, and then someone would unroll the poster, glue it onto a piece of wood or some kind of structure, and they would lean it up outside the movie theater on the street. The idea was that this would reach from the street level all the way to the bottom of the marquee. And of course, what better way to capture King Kong, the ultimate, ginormous monster, and to really catch your eye. So that's just a pretty incredible feat. All right, we're gonna make our way over here for a different monster. All right, when you think of the monster movie, you might think of Godzilla. And that will make perfect sense. He's such an icon in terms of monster movies. So again, though, we're kind of seeing a synthesis of some of the last two things we just saw. The monster movie and kind of the size in terms of these, really big, larger than life monsters, but also dealing with the aftermath of war. Again, we want to think about these images not just as images, and although they are beautiful, but as products of their time and their culture. So this was coming out in Japan in the 1950s. So the memory of the atomic bombs is still very fresh, and even hydrogen bombs had been tested just 2 years before this movie was released. So this is really raw for the people who are dealing with the aftermath of those happenings. So again, we have this sense of kind of the nuclear monster. So the idea is that Godzilla has risen from his slumber at the bottom of the sea because of all of the nuclear testing that had been done by Americans in the film. So they were pretty upfront about that. And so we get Godzilla. That's the result. So again, just a way to drive home that this was, very much a way of people to process what's going on and to think about kind of the aftermath of these huge cultural events. We get some great design elements here as well. We've got the sort of dripping of the text here and that three-dimensionality, the bright colors, the boldness of it. We even get our little, it's alive right here. So we've got a lot of great examples here in this image. All right, now we're gonna head into our last gallery. Okay, all right, so we've come to our last gallery. Again, if you're just joining us, we're here at It's Alive, which is an exhibition at the Columbia Museum of Art, so thanks for being here. So now we've come to our last gallery, and I'm glad you got a little bit of a look around, because in some ways, I like to think that some of the images in this room act as sort of bookends for the few decades that we've been looking at in terms of film history and design, especially these posters. So what I want to do now is really take a good look at this image. Again, we're going back in time a little bit. We're going back to the 1930s. This is, in many ways, kind of the epitome of the early monster movie or horror movie poster. So based on what we've talked about before, things like line, like type, color, composition, what's included, what do you make of this poster? What touchstones do you see that we've already looked at before that maybe seem familiar? What little visual cues do you notice? And
I hate to interrupt, but we actually just had a comment in regards to that. Somebody mentioned that the Dracula eyes from earlier.
Yeah, the Dracula eyes. So again, we see eyes, the imagery of eyes comes up again and again in these horror movie posters, and yellow eyes, right? That bright yellow on that black background that we see all the time. Awesome, thanks, that was great. So take this in, drop in more comments, we love that. If you notice anything else that you've seen before or that seems like something you've noticed that is in these kind of designs, give us a comment, we want to hear about it. All right, so as you're doing that, I'm just gonna kind of move us through this image. So we've already noticed those bright yellow eyes that jump out at you right away from the top there. And then think about color. We talked about the yellow of the eyes. It's not just yellow, right? There's yellow and greens and kind of, again, that sort of yellowish green. It has that sort of sickly quality to it. but also sets a subtle tone for the rest of the image, right? So we've got that yellowish quality, again, sort of yellowish green. Who else is depicted in green? Well, we've got this sort of whoosh, action lines of the figures in green here of our two twin titans of terror, Bela and Boris, right? And so what does that tell us visually? They're linking all of these things visually by using that same color palette. And then who's contrasted with that? Our central figure. Again, our damsel laying very vulnerable, literally being carried in the arms of someone else, but completely at the mercy of others. But look how she's being depicted. Again, we get this sort of yellow, sort of that tinge of yellow maybe coming from the cat eyes, but she's got these lighter pastels, these kind of warmer shades. So she's set up as different than these other characters. So what are we meant to think from that? Well, maybe these are all antagonistic characters, or maybe they're sinister somehow, and she's set up as this innocent victim. So again, we get this kind of dichotomy between different characters. We're not getting a whole scene, we're just getting sort of a mishmash of different characters and how they might interact. Again, the text here, beautiful Art Deco, really classic in terms of the stylization of that. We've got those blocky, chunky kind of letters offset with the outline so that they really stand out. We've got a little bit of script in there as well. So they're doing an artful job of kind of designing and putting all of those different components together. So, and then line literally connects different areas of the page. Action, it indicates movement of some kind. So designers are using the same kinds of tools as all visual artists do. Line, color, shape, all of those things combined to give us a rich image that tells us something about the film, and in this case, something about the time in which it was produced, which is that golden age of cinema, the 1930s, classic Hollywood monster movies. All right, we have one last image to look at. Okay, all right. Now, like I said just a moment ago, I feel like these two images are almost bookends for the time of Hollywood films that we're looking at. So we had a really great classic example just now of all of those different techniques that people were doing early on in kind of the heyday of the early golden age of Hollywood. This represents kind of, the departure and how things have changed over the decades. But there are still some elements that we've noted already, right? So go ahead, if you see something that we've talked about before, that maybe you've noticed from other posters that we've seen today, go ahead and drop in a comment. I want to hear about what things you notice that kind of fit with what we've seen already, this kind of, these patterns or these techniques that are used in these designs, and what seems like it's deviating, what seems a little bit different from, what had been done for, decades on and on. All right, so as you're thinking about that and leaving us some comments, I want to turn our attention to this image because it's really stark, right? There's no color whatsoever. Whereas we had those really beautiful, bright, colorful posters for black and white movies, now we have our, even though we're in the age of Technicolor, we're going back to black and white. So there's this stark black, black and white contrast of, that white color that really jumps out at you. So we've got that sense of contrast. We've also got the handwritten text again. So we're getting away from that really, glossy kind of Art Deco or stylized font. This is, again, that sort of hand-scrawled, looks, irregular, and it looks hurried and chaotic and urgent, right? It even says fear, and it underlines it, so it tells you exactly how to feel about it. All right, so it's giving me some different kinds of imagery, right? There's not a lot of color. We're getting eyes, kind of, right? Absence of eyes in terms of the negative space of what we know that, those would have been. But it's not giving us any other visual information, really, right? We've got this central skull, but that doesn't tell us very much. It just tells us death, right? It might suggest the idea of death, but we don't get any other information about it. We know we're supposed to be afraid, and then we have Night of the Living Dead. So we get a little clue as to what this might be about. This makes perfect sense for a film that was so revolutionary, not just in terms of horror, but just in terms of film in general. This makes a lot of sense. It turned a lot of tropes completely on their head. So I'll give you just a couple of those instances in case you're not familiar with the film. But first of all, we've got a zombie movie, as maybe suggested by the Living Dead title. There were zombie movies before, though. We saw a couple of examples when you panned around the room earlier, but earlier zombie movies, they really didn't have any, agency. They didn't act of their own volition. They were just sort of mindless drones who did the bidding of some mastermind. In later zombie movies, Romero's and beyond, we could argue maybe they're still mindless, but they're usually acting on their own. There's not someone controlling them. So that was a little bit of a distinction. This is also the first time we see cannibalistic zombies. So that's a big shift. That's definitely how I think most of us think of zombies today. It had an African-American protagonist, so that was definitely a departure from a lot of the films that we've seen so far. But the most important thing, I think, without giving too much away, is that it doesn't necessarily give us this nice, pretty, clean resolution that we're used to seeing in other horror films. There's this sort of sense of hopelessness that pervades some of the, I'll say some of the movie. And so that was a shift. That was a real departure. And again, if we think back to the time in which this was made, that makes a lot of sense. This is 1968. So think about what's going on in 1968. I mean, this is a time of upheaval, of unrest, of distrust of authority, of gory images that are coming into your living room every day in the form of the Vietnam War. So there is a lot of, anxiety in general about what's happening in the world. So this idea that these trusted, formerly trusted authority figures are maybe not the source of the ultimate resolution or the solution of the problem is a big shift, but it makes sense. And then, of course, we're still seeing the resurgence of the zombie as a trope today, right? We've got The Walking Dead and Zombieland and all of these movies and TV shows that are still in our cultural consciousness. And why do you think that is? I mean, why are we still so attracted to this notion of the zombie, thinking about our own anxieties? There's a lot to be said for this notion that we're afraid we're becoming zombies, right? That we're all looking at our devices, which I know you are now, but we all do it, right? And so there's this kind of latent fear that, maybe we're becoming drones or sort of mindless. And I think that's why we start to see the resurgence of these kinds of themes that come back again and again. So I'm curious to see what kinds of horror films are going to come out of this particular moment in time. We're certainly living through strange days, and there's a lot of anxiety. So hopefully, we can use horror and art and all of these things as kind of a catharsis and a way to deal with all of the crazy things that are going on in our world. I hope that you've enjoyed this tour. I want to hear all about your thoughts. If you have thoughts on present day horror films, if you're thinking about horror a little bit differently maybe than you did an hour ago, we want to hear what your thoughts are on this experience. There is more to see. I know we didn't quite get to everything, but we've got some great videos for you of Kirk Hammett walking through the space and telling you about some of his favorite pieces. So if you want more, check out our YouTube channel. We've got all kinds of stuff on our Museum from Home page. So we've got all kinds of lectures, how-to videos, all kinds of great stuff. So check out Museum from Home if you're wanting more activities and things to keep you busy during this time. But thank you all for joining us. And again, remember, we want everyone to stay safe. So, wash your hands like you're a mad scientist and try to keep one Frankenstein's monster between you and, other people around you if you go out. And remember, if you wear a face mask, don't wear a hockey mask because it's full of holes. So just pick a different mask. All right, thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this experience. We love being with you, and see you next time.